Hello, everyone. Matt Celeskey here, coming to you from my responsibly distanced work at home office and studio. Um, I'm an artist and a natural history illustrator. And a couple of months ago, I was talking with my friend Kristen at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science. And she had a great idea about doing a stop and sketch program this summer at the museum. I thought it was a really wonderful and exciting idea because I'd always thought it would be great to have a dedicated time where artists of all ages and all skill levels could come in, look at the exhibits, look at the collections, and spend some time getting to know all the cool natural history specimens um, on display both in the galleries and behind the scenes. But here we are. Summer is just about upon us, and for the time being, the museums are still closed. So uh, Kristen and I have been talking about how we can do a stop and sketch program remotely, and we're going to try that today. Unfortunately, none of us have access to the museum exhibits or collections, uh, but we were lucky enough to get some great photographs from the bioscience collections manager, Lindsay. Uh, she was able to get some pictures of some really cool New Mexico biology specimens, and we're going to put a link to those so that you can download them and maybe use them for inspiration. Of course, the museum's just one place to find really cool biology and geology and paleontology in New Mexico. Of course, we're lucky enough in this state to be surrounded by all kinds of great natural history and science. So maybe you found a cool bug in your yard or went on a hike and found just a really interesting rock or leaf or anything. So whatever you find that inspires you to sketch, by all means, let's add it to the mix. We'll figure out how we can collect some of the sketches that people have done and figure out how to put those on display. But for now, I'm going to go through working with one of Lindsay's pictures, and I've got it printed out here. I'm going to switch over to my sketching cam in a minute. And I'm going to show you the steps I would go through if I was trying to get a sketch, maybe a preliminary study for a scientific illustration I was working on, or if I just wanted to learn a little bit more about a cool object I'm seeing. So give me just a minute. We're going to switch over and I'll see you on my drawing table. So today for the sketch that I wanted to work on, I picked this view of a little mammal skull that Lindsay has found in the collections. I just printed it out. I only have a black and white printer at home, but I'm just going to do a black and white sketch, so that should be just fine. Now, looking at the data that's associated with this specimen, it is a rodent skull. It is the skull of a white-throated wood rat, Neotoma albigula, that was collected in the Sandia Heights area of Albuquerque. So I'm sure it was a cute little critter when it was alive, and well, it's not a bad-looking skull either. So, so yeah, we've got a great photograph that Lindsay took of this skull, looking down on the top of the skull, what we would say is the dorsal view. You know, front of it is right here. So there's the tip of the snout. In life, its nose would extend beyond the bone a little bit. These big loops, holes right here would be where the eyes are, and then in the back there would be some of the temporalis muscles that open and close the jaw and help it grind up seeds and plants and the other good things it's eating. We can see a little bit of the teeth down here. I don't know whether the skull is a little bit distorted or maybe it's not directly. The camera was a little bit off to the side when it took the picture, but that's kind of interesting. So you can actually see through the top of the orbit there and down into the jaw. And then of course in the back here we have the skull roof. There's the collection number on there. This was a male specimen, and you can actually see some of the sutures in the bones that are pretty cool. So if I were looking at this skull in real life, well, actually it's kind of better that I have a picture to work from, because I'm sure this thing would be really tiny, you know. It would be hard to see all this detail if I was actually just looking at the skull without using a magnifier or a microscope. But what we're going to do here is figure out how we're going to start, how we're going to get this object into a framework that I can start sketching from. And there's a lot of ways to do that, but I think what I'm going to do to begin is just get a rough sense of the proportions from the photograph onto the paper. Now, if I was to be doing like a real rigorous scientific illustration, there's a lot of ways I could get that pristinely perfect. You could get a ruler and make a bunch of detailed measurements from the photograph, or ideally from the specimen itself. You could overlay a grid on the photograph and then transfer that onto a grid onto your drawing surface. Or if you know that the photograph and your interpretive drawing are going to be side by side, you could even trace. And you know, if you're not feeling comfortable about sketching from scratch, then by all means, you can just get a piece of drawing paper, put it on top, and trace the outlines, and then work to fill in the details. Tracing isn't a bad word. The main thing that you never want to do if you're working from a tracing is allow people to think that the drawing is entirely yours. You always want to give credit to the work that went before you that informed your work. But you know, say we were actually in the museum and looking at this specimen under glass. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to trace it. We'd have to figure out a way to draw this as accurately as we could without actually getting our hands on the specimen. So how would we do that? Well, I'm going to take some measurements, but I'm not going to bother with a ruler. I'm going to do kind of you know, an old artist trick and use my pencil as a measuring tool. And luckily, this printout is just about, you know, from snout to the back of the skull is one pencil length. So that's great. And then if I were to try to estimate where the halfway point is, looks like it's right about here. So what's happening on this line that's going to be sort of our halfway point? Well, it looks like you can see, you know, in this opening for the eye socket, you know, the skull roof gets to its sort of skinniest point right there, which is maybe just in front of the halfway mark. And then it's got its first sort of little flare, and then there's a little bit of an angle. So this is actually probably the edge of where all the eye muscles are. So the eye would be in a, you know, sort of sphere right in here. So this kind of little nubbin of bone that's sort of the back of the orbit, I'm going to use that as my rough halfway point. So on my sketch paper, I'm going to, you know, put a line for the back of the skull really lightly, and a line for the front of the snout. And then I'm going to try to make a little halfway point, and I'm going to double check to make sure I've got that right, again by using my pencil. So if I've got that there and I put that there, well, I'm quite a bit off. So let me move this back a bit And if I do that here, oh, we need to come back even a bit more. See, it's a good thing you don't always rely on your eyes, especially when you're trying to work over a camera. It's not letting me look straight down on the photograph or on my drawing table. Okay, that looks pretty good. So I've got my center line. I'm going to erase the other two just so I don't get confused. I'm going to stretch that all the way across. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to double check this. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to use that same proportional method to figure out the width. And it looks like the width of the skull is actually pretty close to half of its length. So if, if I have this here and I have that there, so I'm going to say that my skull, my drawing is going to be framed within this box, more or less. If I end up wanting to go outside of it a little bit, I'm not going to be too upset about that. Looks like I can come in a little bit more. Okay, I'm gonna go with that for now. And again, this is rough. We'll refine it as we go. And the main thing with any sort of sketch, and apologies, I know I'm bouncing the table a lot. I'm talking and drawing, and it's going to wiggle the surface a bit. So to see if I can get a better camera if we decide to do this again. Okay, so I've got my rough area outlined, and I've got a halfway point front to back. I'm going to make a halfway point side to side, and this will be kind of roughly the midline of the skull. Because the skull is not precisely straight down, the photograph isn't precisely straight down, the top curve of the skull is going to be modified a little bit, but it actually is pretty good if I draw a straight line from the middle of the front of the skull to the middle of the back. It's not too bad. So let me start by, I'm going to do a little curve for the front of the snout. I'm going to do a bit of a bigger curve, and there actually is just a little bit of an angle, so I'm going to exaggerate that a little bit at the back of the skull. I know that, we've kind of got a big, mammals are relatively big-brained, and little mammals are even bigger relatively, or have a bigger brain relative to the size of the skull than big mammals tend to. So I'm going to kind of create, working from a big circle here for this nice big mouse brain. And you can see that if I were to draw a circle on this photograph, the front end of that circle is going to be right behind my halfway point. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. So I also know that I can start to sketch in the skull roof. It's kind of got a little bit of a bulge right there before my, and then it tapers. Remember, its skinniest point is going to be just in front of our halfway mark. So I'm going to put that right there. And yeah, actually, I'm not liking the way we're a little bit off here on our proportions. So that's okay. I'm just going to move my lines over a little bit. They're kind of, what you can call your inspiration lines. You're feeling out the shape and the placement of the skull, and they can be really loose and really sketchy, and that's okay because, we're going to go back and forth using our eraser, using darker lines, and get it all figured out. before we wrap it up. So we have a long way to go here. We've got these nice big fenestra in the maxilla that's going to send out all the nerves and blood vessels to the cheeks and the whiskers. They're pulling in a lot of data from the front of that snout as they're running around in Sandia Heights. So the widest part of the skull I can see is actually back here. So, we're going to do some kind of slanted lines for that and work those in there. And again, we're going to see how this ends up here. I think we're going to have some issues, but that's okay. That's what drawing's about. There's several things that drawings can do. A final finished drawing, obviously you want it to interpret what you're seeing or say something about what you're seeing as accurately as possible. But when you're sketching, you're the one that's learning about the specimen. So this is a way for you to figure out what you're seeing, figure out how the subject of your drawing all fits together. And it doesn't matter whether you're drawing from a live model, whether you're drawing your pet cat or dog or goldfish, whether you're drawing a tree in your neighborhood or a cloud in the sky, you're just kind of feeling it out. You're kind of searching and figuring out what it has to tell you with your eyes. Drawing is really, I think, the best way of seeing. And if you want to understand something, you could do a lot worse than starting by drawing it. Okay, I'm looking at the skull roof. There's these kind of interesting shapes there. It sort of flares out, maybe right around the middle of that circle there. And it connects to the inside edge of that big orbital loop there. There's kind of a big flange of bone at the front, and then it gets really skinny in the sides. So I'm going to try to show that a little bit. And then we've got these kind of triangular flanges of bone. Okay. And then this is really interesting. We've got this nice loop. I don't know how well you can see it on the screen. It's very faint in the printout here, but my guess is, this is where the top of the skull starts to go down to the sides. So that's going to be a real interesting change in the shape of the skull that we can put in our drawing. And my guess is that would be where, that's like the scene where muscles attached to the bone there. Maybe it's jaw muscles for doing whatever grinding it's going to be doing with its little rodent teeth. I'm not going to worry too much about all these little flanges of bone sticking off the back of the skull just yet. Looks like it's a little hidden by the specimen number, but there's a similar loop that's going on back there. Okay, so my drawing's starting to take shape a little bit. I've got kind of the rough form, and if I stand back and look at it, I'm feeling, pretty good. Snow might be a little bit off, but again, I'm not going to worry about it too much because this is just a sketch, and this is me understanding the white-throated wood rat. So first introduction. If we were to have a longer conversation, if I was to really get to know this skull and want to introduce it to the world, say in a museum bulletin or other publication, then you know, we would move forward from this first introduction. But for now, this is me and the wood rat just getting to know each other. Actually, I guess it's mostly just me getting to know the wood rat. Well, wood rat's not going to really learn too much at this point. But that's okay. Just because, and especially because, you know, this is something that's really important whenever you're working from a bone or a fossil or a study skin or any other remains in a natural history collection. It's really easy to get lost in the really beautiful forms and the sculpturing of the bones and the details of the anatomy and the way it all comes together in a visual and tactile sense, because they are, you know, just as objects, they are remarkable, and they, for a lot of us, we find them absolutely beautiful. But you can never forget that these are the remains of a living thing. It's an animal that had a full life, and he had whatever the wood rat equivalent of hopes and dreams and goals for the future were. Interacted with its environment. It lived only a few miles away from where I'm sketching here. So it breathed the same air and smelled the same plants. So you always want to be respectful. You never want to forget that you're working with the remains of a living thing. And so, you know, especially when you're working with them in person, you always want to be respectful of the remains that, however temporarily, are entrusted to your care. And, you know, even if you're not taking them on loan or working in the collections with them, you still want to, you know, come from a place of respect in your drawing. I guess that's the best way to put it. So don't let the coolest aspects of the drawing lead you to forget that that this little wood rat was a living thing, or whatever you're drawing. All right, I'm getting into some issues here. I'm starting to lose my way, so I'm going to clean it up a bit. The eraser is a big friend. I never want to draw without an eraser. You can. There's some benefit to learning without an eraser, but for now, I'm going to try to keep my eraser handy. And remember that my halfway point is actually right about there. So yeah, okay, I think I see what's going on a little bit here. I've got my snout a little bit too long, and I have this area a little bit compressed. Well, I'm going to work to fix that a little bit real quickly, but I don't want to waste too much time doing that, because you're here to watch a sketch, not here to watch me fix my mistakes. But I guess it's all part of the process. really like the way that the bone sort of curves around these openings. Makes you think of all the, you know, all the bundles of nerves that went out to those whiskers. It's pretty amazing to think what this wood rat would have touched and felt, how sensitive they would have been to the world right in front of their nose. It's pretty cool. So yeah, we've got kind of these little pockets in there. Okay, so far so good. What can I do here to adjust that a bit? Yeah, look at that just a little bit more. One thing that I find is helpful, you know, it's easy when you're looking and drawing, especially a form that has so many subtle curves, like a skull. Sometimes by exaggerating the angles that you see, you actually can get a little bit, that translates a little bit better onto the page. Because if you try to draw the curves as you see them, at least for me, I tend to flatten those out when they come down on the paper. So a little bit of exaggeration, or what you think might be exaggeration, can a lot of times be more accurate than you think it's going to be. Okay, I'm going to make some notes. It looks like there's actually 2, 3 teeth, 4 teeth there maybe. But there's a group of 3 cusps that you can see here, and then a group of 4 cusps there. So that's kind of how I'm going to break it up. And they actually go just in front of the halfway point there. So again, trying to keep my proportions in mind. So we've got 1, 2, 3 there, and then just kind of sort of see the cusp, the outer loaf of the tooth. 1, 2, and then there's a littler one that's pointing backwards, and this guy there. All right, so that's kind of a good rough guideline for what I'm seeing there. Over exaggerated that little prong bone there, so knock that back a bit. Okay, I'm starting to get a little too fussy in the details here, and what I really want to start moving towards now is looking for major forms that I can start to push and pull out of the skull. So the lightest areas, the darkest areas. If I look at the photograph, the lightest areas tend to be, you know, this line that sort of delineate the outside of the skull roof and along the outer edge of the snout, as well as the kind of front edges of you know, these arches here, the cheek arches that are going back to the skull. The darkest areas, of course, are kind of the inside wall of this right orbital opening, and then of course the deeper areas in the fenestra, and then there's some subtle shading there as the arches merge back into the back of the skull. So let's start to define those a little bit. I'm just going to start just doing a little scribbly line. As I get this a little more refined, actually looks like we've got kind of a big mass of dark right here. along the side of the snout, and even here on the front side of the snout. And I'm just going to look for some of the kind of mid-range, because it is sort of, it's a light skull on a dark background, so the contrast is a little washed out, but that's okay. We can still find the ways to make this a little bit more of a 3D object. Again, you can sort of see where these flanges of bone connect to the back of the brain case here. And I'm just going to add some shading to that. We've got some nice darks there, so I'm actually going to start. And I'm not super happy with the way this line looks, but as with any drawing, sometimes you've just got to live with what you've got on the paper. Again, if I were to do this further, I might refine that. I might start over if I really didn't like it enough. But like I said, this is me meeting the skull. It's not the final be-all and end-all of what a white-throated wood rat has to teach us. But for me, it's a good start. So as we're doing this, now I'm going to actually sort of start to look at the flow of the bone. Again, it's really subtle, but you can see where, this ridge, it's almost a thin line across most of the skull roof, and then it flares out. It becomes this big sort of triangular shape, sort of a curved triangle or a wave shape or a horn shape almost, where that where that ridge of bone sort of connects with all the bones that are coming together at the back of the snout and up from the base of the eye. So this is kind of a really fascinating part of the bone that's happening right here. And I'm going to try to render that just a little bit, because if I ever do go back and want to learn more about this wood rat skull, I'm going to want to spend some time with the anatomy right there and really figure out what's happening. You can see it's a little bit fainter on the other side, but there's a similar thing happening there. I'm just going to use some shading lines to make the middle of the skull just a little bit darker, which is going to pop these flanges of bone out. And again, I'm just kind of using lines to define the planes of the skull. I guess that's kind of the step that I'm at now. I'm finding the planes of the skull and then using directional lines to shade them in. So we can do that. Use some little short lines to kind of highlight a shadow as this ridge of bone goes back, and we're back around the parietals now. There's actually kind of a nice little suture line at the back of the parietals. So I'm going to just make a quick sketch of that, which is pretty cool. And then I see the front a little bit, but it sort of fades away. And I think I can see where it goes, but I don't want to overestimate it too much. But you can also see pretty clearly in this photograph this bone. So these two are the parietals. So just your basic pencil and eraser is all I'm working with. If we end up doing more of these, maybe we can play with color, maybe we can play with pen and ink or different shading techniques. A nice little foramen there. Hint at. Yeah, very cool stuff. So yeah, if there's anything that you'd like to see, or a feature that you'd like to try, we can explore that in a future Stop and Sketch program. Just let us know. There'll either be comments available here, or you can shoot us an email. We'll provide a way for you to share your thoughts with us. And if you've done any drawings from either the photographs that are coming from the bioscience collections or from cool stuff that you found out in nature, I'd really like to see it. I'm always amazed at how many great artists there are out there, and it's really overwhelming. It's wonderful to see the talent and the different points of view that people bring to their drawings. So yeah, please do share that. I'd be really excited, and I'm sure that we'll find a way to feature some of these drawings on the museum's website or social media. All right, again, getting a little bit fussy with the details here, but the main thing is I just want to get the overall shape of this hoop right and its proportions right. Again, if I was looking at this skull in person, I bet there'd be some really interesting ways that the bone could flow around. You know, I'm sure there's like a lot of little ups and downs that are happening with that zygomatic arch there, but working from one photograph, I'm not gonna try to interpret what I don't really see. Okay, let's darken in this little hole in the skull there. All right, now you can see just like there's the ridges along the back of the skull and around the eye socket that sort of flare out here. On the side of the snout, we've got ridges of bone that actually kind of tuck in to that other one. So that's kind of cool. I'm going to try to showcase that a little bit with my drawing too. You know, you've got the premaxilla on the side there coming up and meeting the two nasal bones on the top of the skull there. So that's kind of an interesting structural element in the skull. Looks like we've got just a little hint of a dimple at the front of the nose there. So I just kind of want to highlight that a touch. All right, I'm feeling, you know, for a sketch, I'm pretty happy where this is going. Play around with the back of the skull here. You know, obviously this is going to start curling around, so I just want to put some shading in there to show that. I also want to sort of highlight these ridges, so I'm going to do a little bit lighter shading on the inside. Down the back of the skull there. Looks like you can see some subtle creasing on this neat flange of bone. That's another area that if I were looking at this in person, I'd really want to spend some time figuring out, you know, what's happening where this spar of bone all of a sudden twists and flattens out and becomes this thin sheet that connects to this ball of bone at the back of the skull. So that's pretty cool. But again, there's only so much I can work into a sketch when you can't see the whole thing. So now I'm going to just spend a little time cleaning up my sketch. I'm going to sort of darken the lines of the skull. And if I had a, this would maybe be the time that I had a colored pencil, I might shade in some of the darker shadows, maybe a cool blue or a purple. But I'm going to keep it simple this time. So yeah, I mean, I think I've actually feel like I've learned quite a bit about this little wood rat skull. Of course, the thing that you always learn when you're drawing something is what you want to know more about. I found all these really neat areas in the skull that I might not have seen if I was just looking at the photograph by itself. Drawing is in large part about being open to what you see and experience in the world, and internalizing it and processing it and trying to show other people what you see when you open yourself up to new experiences in the world. So, it's a good way to recharge if you're feeling stressed. It's a good way to refocus your energies if you feel you're at a stopping point or you're blocked somehow. And if you make it a practice in your life, I think it's a great way to just be open to new experiences and to learning things as they are, or at least in a way that you hadn't considered them before. And I think whatever solutions we find as individuals or as communities or as a country moving forward, being open to new ways of understanding is going to be a big part of how we get there. So a little bit of drawing philosophy at the end of this, but yeah, there we go. We've got a wood rat skull, at least a preliminary study of one. We've spent about 40 minutes talking and sketching, and I hope that it's been entertaining for you. I hope that you've had a chance to draw along. And again, I'd love to see what you're working on. I hope we'll have a chance to do this again soon. I'm going to switch back and sign off. So thanks for joining me. This is Matt Celeskey for the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science, saying thank you, be well, stay safe, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.